How's it going,
Hey, how you
everyone?
doing,
My
Logan?
name is Logan. This is Web3 Anarchy. Justin, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
Doing great. It seems like our audio is maybe off for a second there. Does it sound all right now?
Okay. Yeah, it sounds good to me. I didn't hear anything.
All right,
But
great.
we
So
have a great guest
exciting
coming up with
episode
us.
today. Yeah,
We've got Justin Newton, the CEO and co-founder of NetKey, which is a leader in validation solutions, KYC, AML. And he's also on the leadership committee for the anti-money laundering working group in the U.S. Chamber of Digital Commerce. So we'll be talking to him about NFT scams and rug pulls.
awesome, Justin. I think we should just get right into it and bring Justin Newton onto
Hey,
stage.
everybody.
Hey, Justin, how are you today?
I am doing pretty awesome. How are you guys?
Doing well.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Thank you so much for coming out to speak with us today. So, from what I understand, as a story that we have up here, this is from our own Chris Caccia on Benzinga. There was recently kind of historic thing with convictions around a rug pull scam in NFT space. So this is, or I guess, child of files charged, that I should say, with 1.1 million stolen from people who invested in these Frosties NFTs last year, and then the founders just kind of pulled out. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about that incident a little bit, Justin?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is just one of a number of incidents that have come up over actually, the last few weeks and months, where basically founders went and did fundraises. Years ago, back in 2017, 2018, the fundraises that they did were for ICOs. And many of those ICO projects were very legitimate projects that turned into important projects and platforms that we see in use today. Some of them ended up being attempted to be really good projects, but they didn't meet their goals in one way or another. And that's true in the centralized startup world as well, right?
Sure.
Most venture funded startups fail, right? And so, we saw some of that happen out of ICOs. And then, we saw some of them that were just, flat out fraudulent, where they were basically doing a fundraise to take the money and run.
Right.
Well, this year's hype cycle, there's really two things that are going on in this year's hype cycle. One is DeFi and one is NFTs. And, you're seeing a lot of that same story play out again in this space. There's a ton of very legitimate projects that are doing very groundbreaking things. And while, 10 years from now, they may seem elementary compared to what's being built, based on that history and experience and things like that, they're literally laying the foundations for the future. And, creating some of those core seed ideas that, everybody, again, is going to use to grow off of. There's going to be other ones that tried out there, and in the NFT world, much like the art world, will turn out to be much less valuable, but not through any lack of intent on behalf of the artists, just because they didn't end up being successful. And then you're going to have this third category, which is people that want to take the money and run, because when there's a lot of money flowing into an industry, you've only got to scam a very, very tiny percentage of them for it to be worth your time and effort if you're not going to bother building a product. Right. And so you're seeing examples of that in the NFT space. You're seeing this example that we're talking about here, and there have been a couple of others. And you're now starting to see some of the first criminal prosecutions around it. I think literally just starting really over the last month or so. If we follow the ICO cycle, we may still be talking about things like this in 3 or 4 years. But some of it will be a play out of stories that started now. And some of it will be some ongoing stuff. But I think it's something you should expect. But as importantly, since we should expect it, as an industry, we need to start to build the defenses to protect the end users and the investors against these kinds of scams, so that they can have the faith and confidence in our industry and ecosystem that we are all going to need to grow and thrive.
So, why are these being addressed now? Like, why are the first cases being charges being brought up right now? Since I guess this has been a consideration, something that people have kind of talked about since roughly this time last year, certainly by like early summer last year.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a couple things. One is you don't really see prosecutions or cases made until they've had time to build evidence,
Right.
right? And again, you heard about ICO scams as early as 2017, but you didn't start hearing about prosecutions about it, until like a year later, and you
Right.
didn't start to hear about them happening in any volume for multiple years later. And so I think that you're going to see again much of the same cycle play out here
Hmm.
where it takes time once people become aware of it
Hmm.
for prosecutors to build their cases and build their stories. Among other things, prosecutors tend to be very cautious in the beginning
Right.
because they know that the early cases are going to become case law,
Hmm.
and so they want to have some wins on the book so that in the future it's easier for them to win,
Right.
right? And so just that is going to introduce some of the delay.
Hmm. Okay. So tell us a little bit about it. It caught my interest. The Chamber of Digital Commerce. You serving on the leadership committee, because the counterpart in the Ukraine, the U.S. counterpart in the Ukraine, has become very famous recently since they have become like de facto in charge of crypto policy in that country and the very badly needed assistance that they're receiving in the form of crypto from just everyday investors. So tell me a little bit about the Digital Chamber of Commerce in the U.S. and what your purview is and who you're working with.
Yeah, no worries. And to be clear, I'm on the leadership committee of the anti-money laundering working group there. I'm not
Mhm.
on the executive committee of the entire association.
Okay.
Digital Chamber is a trade association for companies that are working inside of the crypto space that is, working primarily around helping to formulate policy with the help of industry that is blockchain and crypto friendly.
Hmm.
So, legislation that helps to promote the use of blockchain, promote the use of cryptocurrency, promote the use of DeFi, and also acts as one of the industry's concentration points for interaction with regulators in a proactive way to try and help shape regulation
Hmm.
before it gets fully in place. And so, like Coin Center or like Blockchain Alliance, you'll see Digital Chamber will frequently be filing, public comment letters on any new regulation or legislation that comes out. You'll see, amicus briefs for certain court cases. You'll
Right.
see, for example, they came out with a blueprint for a national blockchain policy and framework. They come out with other tools for policymakers to help educate them about crypto and blockchain.
Hmm.
And they'll work with the legislators and regulators and others, particularly the crypto friendly legislators, to help formulate policy, promote it, and to move it forward.
Hmm. So, and you, of course, like essentially, they serve an advisory role. I believe, and you serve on the leadership committee for AML. You're sort of advising. You're advising them. They are in turn providing advice to Congress, to the U.S. government in terms of policy.
Yeah, I mean, so it's Digital Chamber is a membership driven organization.
Mhm.
And so, really anyone in the membership who has feedback on a topic or comment
Mhm.
can join the working groups around it,
Right.
and to provide their own feedback and thoughts
Mhm.
into the process and into the policy. And whether you're on the leadership committee or not on the leadership committee doesn't really change your ability to have input on the feedback that the Digital Chamber gives. I'll tell you,
Mhm.
there's a number of times that I've been slightly out of sync on things where the membership feels a different way, and we go the way the membership wants to go, of
Right.
course. The things that the leadership committee does is sometimes will be more likely to be someone that will be talking directly to the regulators or legislators when they reach out, or to
Mhm.
join working groups, inside of the regulator, or in some cases to, uh, again, not dictate everything that the working group's going, but to help shape the agenda to allow it to work in a more efficient way on the highest priority issues.
Mhm.
I'd love to
Okay. And
jump in for a quick second
yeah.
if that's okay, Justin.
Oh, yeah, please.
So crypto regulation seems like this big, like scary thing that's out there, but in reality, it's necessary for the market to mature and for institutions to adopt this in any sort of major capacity, right? So being that they're already so behind on crypto, legislation and regulation, how far off do you think NFT regulation is, and how do you think that they'll try to balance, not stifling innovation inside U.S. borders?
Yeah, well, look, I think there's a few things that are going on there, and I think that we can sort of see where things are going. And you can see that regulators are already leaning into NFTs, right? And so, like, one example of that would be FATF, which is the global regulatory body that sort of the countries, I don't want to say report into, but sort of report into, around financial law and regulation and how they follow up. FATF, every year up until now, when they were talking about their digital currency stuff, they actually always used the word fungible tokens when they talked about the tokens. And this year in the guidance, they removed the word, or they added the word, or sorry, they removed the word fungible, right? And so they brought non-fungible tokens into scope for regulation literally by removing one word from their guidance from one year to the next, right? And so they've already signaled.
Is that maybe an oversight, though?
No. It was definitely intentional. I mean, there's feedback.
Sure, but is it
enough?
Is it enough to account for all the differences?
Well, no, it's not. But what they're basically telling is they're not creating the detailed regulatory framework. What they're saying is, regulators, you need to go get the detailed regulatory framework around it now. They're basically saying, fungible tokens are now, or non-fungible tokens are now inside of scope. So, what's that going to mean, right? What are the regulations likely to mean? Well, what that's likely to mean is look at what's happening in the fungible world, right? So, a marketplace, which is basically like an exchange, is likely to come under regulation because exchanges are under regulation in the crypto world. And so, while there may be some differences in the way that they're regulated, and there probably should be, effectively, you would think of a marketplace like an exchange, right? Typically you might consider looking at the issuer of an NFT like the issuer of another token. And what are the requirements there? Art has some exceptions around anti-money laundering that may make that not the case. So it may be that the issuers actually end up with lighter regulation than an issuer would inside of the normal crypto world, unless it's a security. And by the way, I need to say, A, none of these regulations have been written. B, I'm not a lawyer, so you should talk to your own about any of this kind of stuff. And I'm definitely not a regulatory lawyer since I'm not a lawyer. But inside of that, we do pay a lot of attention to these regulations, and so I can comment on them generally, right? So some other places where you're going to see things is you're probably going to see similar anti-money laundering rules around NFTs because it's frankly, an NFT is almost a better way to launder money than Ethereum because you can't prejudge the value.
Sure.
In the same way that you can with a fungible token. And so I would expect that there's likely to be an AML regime that comes in place around it, but there's been basically no definition around that yet.
Right. Sure. The fine art world has had that problem for a long time, right? Fine art is notoriously a vehicle for really big spenders.
Totally true. But again, it's like there's way more friction in the traditional art world, than there is in the cryptocurrency world. And there's like a lot of opportunities to do weird things to try and make the money laundering more effective. So for example, you can do a bunch of trades with yourself at different values to start to establish the price of something.
Sure.
Which it's harder to do in the art world. And now you've created an on-chain history that may prove the value when actually it was just you faking it the whole time. So there's some different risks than there are with traditional art. And so I think, what we're likely to see is going to be like a blend of art being a lighter touch, but crypto being a heavier touch and ending up somewhere in the middle.
Interesting. There is this perception when we talk about regulations that somehow, that it's literally, Nancy Pelosi handing down her wisdom about Web3 to us. But of course, it's not that way at all, is it? We break down into subcommittees with leadership committees under that, which then essentially make the recommendations that go up the chain, if I'm not mistaken. So in a lot of ways,
and then after that, all the details get written by the regulator, right? So the Congress sets broad policy.
Right.
Right. So typically, like, what Congress will say is something like, investigate this and make sure you're controlling for these kinds of risks.
Right.
Right. And then the details of how that happens gets pushed down to the financial regulator. Right. Or, they'll, I don't know. Sometimes legislation gets more detailed. For example, some of the things that are talking about, tax reporting levels and things like that. Frequently, some of that stuff would normally get pushed down to regulation as handled in legislation. But generally, you want to think of like legislation as being high level and setting direction. And then the detailed work actually gets done by, policy and regulatory wonks that have been working inside of Treasury and IRS and other departments for decades.
There's a surprising will to exploit Web3. I did an interview with Andrew Yang just a few weeks ago. It seems to be that he's got a whole new group where he's kind of making that his whole central thing. What do you think is stirring the interest on Capitol Hill toward regulating and capitalizing on the space? It seems that they've decided that blockchain is more useful than it is dangerous.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if you look back to 30 years ago, right, the United States decided that it was going to lean into internet innovation, and that it was going to be the leader in that area. And that literally created 2 generations of wealth generation in the US so far, right? We're like literally 30 years into it being, previous to crypto, the biggest wealth generation event that happened in the history of mankind, because the US decided to take a lead on it, right? Well, the message has finally gotten through, not to everybody. I think we could all name at least one senator and at least one congressman that hasn't gotten the message yet, maybe more than that. But for a lot of people, right, they've actually now gotten the message that, like the internet, what cryptocurrency is, what Web3 is, what all these other things are, is they're open and permissionless platforms for innovation, right? And what an open and permissionless platform for innovation does is it does 3 things. It creates inclusion. In the case of the internet, literally someone standing in the field in the middle of nowhere has access to the same information as an MIT professor. And in crypto, we at NetKey were helpful in onboarding 4 million Salvadorans into the Chivo wallet, 3 million of whom had never had a bank account before. So it was the first time in their life anybody in their family had an account balance somewhere, right? And so, it's already happening in crypto with inclusion. You're going to see an innovation happen. In the early days of the internet, we definitely never saw like Uber and Airbnb and Pokemon Go and those kinds of things coming, right? And in the same way, I don't see today where crypto is going. I think we're in such the early innings of NFTs, for example, that people are going to look back at it as like the pets.com sock puppet 20 years from now. Important in getting us to the future and like critical on the path, but it's going to be looked back on primitive compared to the things that, frankly, people a generation from now are building who didn't grow up with the same blinders that you and I might have, right? Because they grew up in this world. And then finally, what it's done, these open permissionless innovation platforms, is they've created waves of value creation, right? And that's the part the US saw on the internet side that said, we want to capture that again in crypto. You're starting to see that with many of these more mainstream politicians instead of the ones that have taken the extreme fringe edge on this position. And, they see that value creation message. And so, when the frame of these networks is that their inclusion, their innovation, and their value creation, it's much harder to be against them than when the message around them is that they're money laundering, they're sanctions evasion, and they're buying drugs on the dark web, right? And so it took us a long time to get the politicians to see the vision that many of us saw, a long time ago, frankly, because there was a lot of stuff that had to get built to make it seem more real, right? But now that message is starting to get through. And, you're also seeing politicians who frankly see political advantage in being smarter than the people that are opposing it.
Sure, absolutely. Since we have a question over here that coming from Black Mage, what do you consider to be an appropriate balance of regulation? I know we're just talking about your opinion here. You've certainly gotten an impression of how this works and what the key players are. What is the balance that they're looking for that matter? Between regulations and overregulation.
Yeah. So I mean, look, I think if I look at what the Biden executive order said and read it, one, I think it's so much better than what we've been seeing out of the government before that in terms of crypto policy. But number two, I actually think it's not that far off of what I think is the right approach to take, which is one, in every rule that you make and in everything that you do, you need to take into account that this is a platform for inclusion, for innovation, and for value creation, and that this is going to be important to the economic future of our country.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you're creating rules and regulations, you need to have that as one of the primary things that's on your list. So like, I'm going to kill this goes away. You can't, that's not on your plate anymore. You don't get to think about that. You don't get to bring it up in meetings, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of the discussion. The discussion is this is something that we want and something that has to be part of the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what are the things that we need to do to make that okay, right? We need to protect consumers, right? We were here to talk a little bit about rug pulls today in the beginning, and we did.
Yeah.
And, none of us want that happening, right? We don't want new people coming into our industry or ecosystem that are eager to be a part of it to get taken advantage of, get a bad taste in their mouth, and then not come back, right? So like in the traditional centralized world in marketing, it costs you 10 times as much to get back a customer you lost as to get a new customer that you never had before.
Right.
Because once you've lost their trust, it's impossible to get them back. So as an industry, I really want to make sure that these rug pulls and these other things are happening as little as possible, because they're preventing the future that I want to create and that I want us all to get to take advantage of. So that's one of the things that's at the top of the list, right? The other things that they have on their list is, they're concerned about securities fraud and securities issues, right? That's something that is important to them. To me, that sort of falls under the consumer protection banner, right? I think it's a little more overreaching than that. And that's a place where I think they'll probably maybe go further than I would if I was in charge. They wouldn't put me in charge, but that's okay. And then the other
would have to, the line of succession to bring us to that would be incredible.
It would be a long, it'd be a long line. Yeah. Like my brother went to high school with one of the former president's sons. That feels far away. And then the other thing they care about is anti-money laundering and sanctions. Right. And honestly, so the two places where the battlefronts are going to be drawn is, where is the line on securities, right? And that's not the battlefield that I play in, but there's a lot of people that are focused in that area. In Digital Chamber, it's the Token Alliance that focuses in that group, but there's a lot of companies focused on the securities aspect of it, and a lot of individuals focused on that aspect. So, and then there's going to be, where does the line get drawn with respect to money laundering, counterterrorism financing, and sanction screening. And I think there are a couple of different ways to look at this, around this. To me, where I end up on it is, I sort of end up that it is very likely that we as an industry are going to basically end up with the same rules as the financial system, except slightly adapted for what the differences are. Right. So like, there's some ways that crypto is scarier than cash, right? Sure. The cross-border nature, instantaneous transactions, stuff like that. It makes, so there's new risks to control because of that and things like that. So I think that we'll see some differences there. And to me, a place to hold the line is anytime that they're trying to push past where the rest of the financial world is. That's a place for us to throw up our arms and bring out the torches and pitchforks and say, that's not right. You can't put us at a competitive disadvantage at the same time we're trying to encourage the growth of this because we believe it's the future, right? So that's the one. I think there's another perfectly logical approach to take, which is to say the existing financial regulations have actually gone too far, and that maybe we shouldn't accept that same push inside of our industry and ecosystem. I would say to me, I think that's going to be harder to win.
Right.
And as a result, we may end up worse than the existing financial system if that's where we try to draw the line.
Cool.
Because we'll kind of have lost our trench, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And so, it's not where I would go, but I definitely understand why other people would go there and why that's a very valid opinion to have and a very valid place to take.
Well, so often the old is built on the new is built on the skeleton of the old system. So there are hundreds of different anecdotes within the U.S. and going back to the U.K. about why we still use feet for measurement, why roads are a certain width. There are all sorts of anecdotes like that. Where essentially like our road patterns and the width of our roads were established during the time of carriages, and of course when cars came along, we retrofitted. That seems to be what we do, or at least I think what humanity does, but what the U.S. particularly does. In terms of regulation overall. So, how much are they going to be able to cram this square peg into the round hole of traditional finance? Web3 obviously has a two-way exchange. That's a very different equation with the creator and the participant than Web2 had. So, are we going to be able to carry over the same sensibilities?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting. And, something to watch as an early indicator of that right now and sort of where we go and what happens is the EU Parliament actually passed a resolution or law or something last week that basically put new regulations on crypto that do move the bar forward quite a bit, right? And so one of the things that they do inside of that new regulation is if I'm on an exchange and say Logan is on his unhosted wallet, let's say running Coinbase or Edge Wallet on his phone or something like that, and he and I are transacting, Coinbase would need Logan's validated identity. They would actually need that with an unhosted wallet transaction. That's a little different than the financial system in that, like, that's not the way it works, like with cash, right? Or things like that. There's some things that are different there. And is a place where, regulators are responding to what they perceive as a different risk in crypto, the cross-border nature, right? It's unlikely that I'm going to be like transacting in $10,000 cash with a sanctioned individual and then depositing it in my bank, where it might be easier to do something like that in crypto. They're responding to that. And this will be an interesting, I think, opportunity to see of how effective is the community at messaging around policy to try and push this back and turn this back. If I'm honest, I think that where that law is going is probably where regulation is eventually going for crypto. We built products kind of expecting or anticipating that this is where regulators may be going. Right. I do think it could be a little too early for this right now in terms of where the industry is. And what the real risks are today.
Obviously, there's a limited amount of time to get this right. Where do you see the U.S.'s regulatory timeline at?
I think that they're going to put out the bulk of the frameworks of regulation, so the important stuff over the next 6 to 12 months. The executive order was basically, it's sort of the public starting gun. But I know all the agencies have been looking into this since the beginning of the administration. We directly, Digital Chamber, other organizations, Blockchain Alliance, other organizations we know of have been in very regular and active discussions with folks throughout SEC, CFTC, Department of Treasury, OFAC, others, just getting them up to speed, having discussions about what's important, what's not important, why crypto matters, so that they're ready to hit the ground running and to start really building these things.
Right. So, if you don't mind, at this point, we usually often go over to Twitter Spaces, but I think for today we're going to stay here rather than doing the after party thing. I hope that's okay with you, Justin Newton. I feel
cool by me.
Your last name, since we've got a paradox now with two Justins in the same show. How can we keep track? But yeah, we'll stay on here and talk about this a little bit more. I'd like to get to talking about essentially, there are a lot of parts of the NFT space that make me feel like a little old, if I'm to be completely honest. I love art. I've been involved in art my whole life, honestly. So I'm thrilled to see art become part of the fore of the conversation, and not to mention all the incredible people coming into the space. I just got to interview David Cronenberg. If you haven't got a chance to read my show, or read my column, those who are watching, please go ahead and take a look. What a genius! What a brilliant guy. He did pictures of his kidney stones and ran them as an NFT. It's a little gross, but he's David Cronenberg. This is what we expect from him. He's the body horror guy, right? But you know, if you are looking into a project, I mean, one thing that's of course staggering is the number of new ideas and new projects that are coming into the space. How do you, now I know that in addition to belonging to the leadership committee, you also are running a verification and a KYC AML organization, which it sounds like is working globally. Do you have thoughts for our viewers on how people can just basically protect themselves, how they do their due diligence in order to not get, well, I don't know if you can ever 100% insulate yourself, but hopefully not be fooled.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's usually a lot of or a number of red flags that you can look at, right? In the normal world, the anonymity of the founders is frequently a red flag. I would say in this space, it's not a red one, but it's maybe a yellow one. And if there is anonymity behind the founders, anonymity can be fine, but is there another way that they were able to build reputation? Right, by doing other things, by having a history of having created something or having done something, right? Some way to validate that, because really, what you're looking at is really one of two things, to help prevent scammers, right? One is you either want to have some kind of like criminal recourse, criminal recourse, or a way to get your money back that way. Or
lots of criminal resources too.
Yeah, maybe that. Or you want to have some kind of surety that the person that you're giving your money to has as much to lose as you do if they're not successful, right? And so if whoever they are has otherwise built a reputation or a brand that has value, right, then there's something that they've got to risk there. Although, we've seen some YouTube people and things like that have been perfectly willing to burn their viewers in crypto scams. So, it's not 100% guarantee there. The other is like, be careful giving up too much of your value before they give up some of theirs.
Right.
If
this was in vogue last year, though. I mean, like last year, it was more fashionable, and frankly, as a journalist, it drove me nuts because I would ask people, what their names were, and it'd be like, insane marsupial or whatever, and I'd be like, okay, what's your title? Like, what's your real name?
Yeah.
What should I call you? Because like even I doing the interview don't like to talk to someone who I can't identify. There's whatever claims he makes, I can't verify them. But it was the norm. It was fashionable in projects. Of course, that's changing now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, right. People talk about, crypto networks don't require trust.
Yeah.
Right. And, that is true in a very limited sense, right? Sure. They don't require trust for the transaction to complete. Right. But that doesn't mean that every activity around that transaction, like the actual business deal that's being done, does not require trust. Right. And frequently in the regular world, one of the ways that we trust each other is through identity. Right. And it's actually it's the reason that we started and built Netkey is when we got into the space in 2014 when it was just Bitcoin. The Ethereum white paper wasn't yet released. And so we said, look, it's too early to figure out all the problems crypto is going to solve. So let's try and figure out the problems that these decentralized networks are going to have. And one of the first thing that really came up was identity. And identity as it relates to compliance is one, but it's really as it relates to risk and how it relates to trust. And, for us, what we believe is that over time, the trust that's going to get built over these networks is again going to be based around identity. And I base that on the fact that that's what the mainstream and the mass market wants right? Like, if I'm a crypto anarchist, I'm perfectly happy transacting with a hash of a public key.
Right.
My guess is that, my brother or my mother or my mother-in-law, or, even my sister-in-law, who is an incredibly smart engineer and technical person, so it's not a technical limitation, would rather transact with a person than with a hash of a public key, right? Like, if they're sending $10,000 to someone, they want to know it's Joe. Not that it's like CX2347A, right? And so, I think that over time, we're going to see identity start to seep back into this space for the majority of things. However, what we'll see is actually privacy start to get restored back into the blockchain networks themselves, either through privacy by design, through networks like Monero and Zcash, or through transaction level privacy showing up through things like Lightning Network. Right. And so we're going to see people able to be more public with their real identities, because that's not going to get tied to all their transaction stuff in the way that today, the only way to remain anonymous is to be anonymous, because the pseudo-anonymity breaks immediately.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, obviously that's how the Bonnie and Clyde duo that got away with what, 3.7 billion or something like that. I mean, honestly,
yeah, it was big, astronomical.
I mean, essentially they put it in a wallet and then it sat in that wallet low these many years, and it seems like they've basically gotten dinged every time they've tried to take anything out of it, doing $500 gift cards, that sort of thing. So it is a paradoxical space where we talk about, privacy of the user, but everything is publicly tracked and publicly available.
I agree with that. I believe that on-chain transaction transparency is a bug that we thought was a feature. And I'm happy to see things like layer 2 networks like Lightning that start to take that away. Right? Like, the only things that should be on the blockchain and public for everyone to see are the things that are absolutely required to maintain the trust of the network. And, thank goodness these layer 2 networks have figured out a way to maintain transaction privacy without violating the underlying trust model of the networks. Like, honestly, smarter than I am in that area, and super glad that they did it.
Justin, decentralized identity is something super, super important. Let's touch on like centralized versus decentralized identity protocols. Who is it up to label these wallets? Are we best off with a decentralized version?
Well, you sort of have to define best off. Right now, the challenge that we have today is the way that the laws and regulations are written in most countries in the world. Decentralized identity doesn't really work for KYC, unfortunately. And the reason basically has to do with the way that the risk and liability is set up. If, let's say that I'm the KYC officer at one company, and, I trust a KYC that you, Logan, did. And let's say that you didn't do the job perfectly. I, as the responsible compliance officer in a completely different company, could theoretically go to jail for that if I trusted what you told me and hadn't done my own due diligence to make sure that that was right. Right. So today, and so what that basically means is, in most cases, whoever it is at the end of the day, at the top of the chain, that would be the person that actually went to jail, is like NFW. That is not happening, right, until the law changes. Now, what I can say is there's a lot of, there's two tracks that are really going on right now. One is there's technology platforms that are aggressively building towards decentralized identity platforms. And many of them now understand the regulatory environment much better than the early ones did. Many of the early decentralized identity networks didn't think about identity the way that a regulator did. And so it meant there was no way that they were ever going to cross over. Many of the newer networks that we're talking to are thinking about it enough like the regulators do, that it may become acceptable in the near future, if that makes any sense. Like, it's a close enough bridge that, we may be able to get the regulators there. The other thing that's happening on the other side is there are actually some innovative countries that are looking at building out legal, regulatory, and even insurance frameworks to help protect against those liabilities so that decentralized identity can be used in the future for risk and compliance. I'm in conversations on both sides of that. I'm working with the tech platforms to get the tech platform side right, and we'll be announcing work we're doing with some of them around verifiable credentials and others for KYC purposes going forward. And we're also working directly with governments that are working on creating regulatory frameworks to make this a legal and good thing as well. And so, these are things I'm very excited about for the future, and I think are going to be an important part of the way we help with compliance in the future, because I really do believe these networks, as they're more mature, will be better at controlling risk than the existing networks, at the same time that they're going to be less friction for the user and less cost throughout the system. So it's going to like help all around, better, cheaper, faster. It'll literally be all three. It's just going to take a little bit of time to get there. And so, that's sort of where we're at today on the decentralized identity side. And so, unfortunately, for compliance purposes, if you're using it for compliance, today you sort of have to go with centralized KYC. And again, it's regulatory and risk stuff, or regulatory stuff. Now, if you're using it for risk purposes, right? If you don't have a regulator looking over your shoulder, and what you're trying to do is keep people from creating fake accounts on your system, or keep people from trying to defraud your something. Now you might choose to use a decentralized solution as a part or all of that package, because it may help you control the risks that you have, right? Without running into that regulator problem that exists today.
Right. But there still has to be a central point of truth. I mean, like there's still, somebody has to have some accountability somewhere in the chain, or else it's
right.
far too dodgy.
Definitely true. Right. And so, like, for example, one of the countries we're talking to that's trying to build frameworks around this, if we, for example, were a validator in that framework, we would actually have to get regulated, right? Where today we're not a regulated entity anywhere that we operate. And so it would actually create additional burden on us and cost on us that we don't have today to be able to participate in those kinds of ecosystems. And so it's an additional lift for companies like ours to get involved beyond the technical experimentation and other things.
What privacy or zero knowledge technologies are most exciting to you right now?
Sure. So look, for me on the privacy side, I think that any private data should only be exchanged directly peer-to-peer between the counterparties. I really like zero knowledge proof for certain applications. I think that they provide a lot of value. I think that there's still one challenge that they have, again, when you start to run into either the financial or the regulated state, which is a combination of two problems that when they come together become really bad. The first is there's no way to audit a zero knowledge proof, right? Like you can't go and like audit the results of what happened there. It just, you do it. And the second is like, if normal encryption fails, the result is that you can read the data, right? If a zero knowledge proof encryption fails, the result is you can lie, right? And so if the encryption fails for a zero knowledge proof, I can tell a lie in the zero knowledge proof, and there's no way for anyone ever in the future to be able to tell that lie happened, right? And so, unlike the Bitcoin blockchain, where if there's a lie on it, everyone can see it and audit it, and if the encryption failed, you would be able to see that was going on. In the case of ZKPs, so for example, Zcash very early on actually had a bug in Zcash that could have caused hidden inflation of the supply. So a hacker could have actually created more Zcash, and to this day, no one would know.
Wow.
They don't think anyone did, but there's actually no way to prove it. Unless someday like more Zcash showed up on exchanges than it's supposed to exist in total. Right, that would be one way to tell it. But other than that, really, there's no way that they can ever go back and audit that there was no new Zcash created.
How is that possible? How is that possible? How is that possible? Do they have to wait until the entire run of all of those coins are minted and then determine from there compared to the white paper? How is there no?
Well, you can't tell from on chain. Right. Okay. So literally the only way would be if enough coins got deposited on exchanges
Wow.
that it exceeded the supply.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so if you looked at that point in time and said, oh, more people have deposited coins on exchanges than there's supposed to be in the whole universe, well, now you know that the supply was inflated. Right. But if they inflated the supply 10%, 15%, you might never know.
Wow.
Earlier, you mentioned that there were like layer twos or other blockchains that were taking full advantage of the mainnet security, but adding privacy. What would be some examples of those?
Yeah, I mean, so probably the best one I can give is Lightning, right? So if you look at what the Lightning Network is on Bitcoin, right? So it does, the primary reason it was designed was for speed and scalability, right? As you know, on the normal Bitcoin network, it can do maybe a dozen transactions a second. And, it takes 10 minutes for a block to settle, right? And things like that. On the Lightning Network, the transaction capacity is effectively limitless because transactions can be parallelized through the network. They don't have to all go through one thing. And then, the second is they settle instantaneously. Right. And so I've been spending a bunch of time down in El Salvador since the Bitcoin law passed there. And I can tell you consistently, my Bitcoin Lightning payments are faster than credit cards, like dramatically faster than credit cards. Right. And so it's really cool. But one of the side effects of it is it takes all of the transactions off chain.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The way that it works, the individual transactions don't happen on the chain. And today, and so that increases privacy. Mm-hmm. Because while you can see what my end balance is on chain, you actually can't see the individual people that I was transacting with.
But it decreases decentralization. So but it decreases decentralization.
So, I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, yes and no. It does, but it doesn't have to. Over time, the Lightning Network mesh will become very robust. Right. And I would say look at how DNS on the internet works today. Right. Sure. DNS on the internet is it's technically centralized, but it's so distributed that it's never mattered.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, I think the Lightning Network eventually ends up in a phase where we are something like that. Right. Today, it's not there. Today, it's more centralized. But if you run into a centralization issue on Lightning, then you fall back to the regular blockchain transaction.
Mm-hmm.
Are there not rules for verifiers of snarks, though?
Rules for verifiers of
snarks? Are there not potentially a role for somebody to fulfill would be to validate these zero knowledge transactions for potentially a week-long period after they're submitted to the mainnet, typically with roll-ups, right? I think Polygon is one of the teams working on something like this. But basically, a zero knowledge proof is a proof, right? It proves that you encrypted properly the data that you claimed is in there. So is there not a role for somebody to validate these proofs?
Yes, I'm sure that there are people that are going to be doing validations into zero knowledge proofs. I'm not sure I'm 100% understanding the question.
Yeah, and maybe there's some misunderstanding on my end as well. But I presume to get the full security of the mainnet, you need to have the verifier of these proofs equally as incentivized as the validators of the mainnet itself.
So there are incentives for people that are operating nodes in the Lightning Network. There are fees and transaction fees that get involved. They get paid to node operators. So there is a separate incentive system for it. That said, they're not using zero knowledge proofs in Lightning. The privacy comes other ways. So it's not a zero knowledge proof that's getting verified or validated as a way to make it happen, but simply the nature of not having all transactions be transparent to all participants provides additional privacy. Right. So it's the difference between me sending you a message by adding you on Twitter, right, and me sending you a message on Signal. Right. If I send you a message on Signal, even Signal doesn't know I sent it to you. The only people that know I sent it to you is me and you. Right. And that's effectively the way the Lightning Network works. If I @ you on Twitter, the whole world knows I sent it to you.
No, isn't that kind of autonomy likely to be isn't some of crypto's autonomy overall likely to go through a period of some challenge, at least unless we very carefully thread the needle in reference to the brutal attack by Russia on the Ukraine. We have to be very clearly on the right side of history, or else run afoul of our own government. Essentially, feel their wrath if we allow Vladimir Putin's and other oligarchs' money to escape, which has been their concern up till now. So, how do we thread this needle? We're kind of being uncomfortably scrutinized right now.
Well, man, you were a straight man for me on this issue. I actually had an article published on this on NASDAQ yesterday, just talking about specifically this issue. But in terms of the topic itself, look, I think that
like an op-ed piece was like an op-ed.
That was a byline, byline.
I'd be interested in reading that. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. The timing is good for your question. Thanks for lining me up like that.
Sure.
But really, as I look at it, this is something that's been actually close to me and important to me for a number of years. It's one of the reasons that we've built things the way that we do. It's one of the reasons I think it's critical for us that when we build anti-money laundering tools or other risk reduction tools inside of our network, as much as possible, we're building scalpels and not sledgehammers, right? And, unfortunately, a lot of the tools that have been chosen to be implemented up till now are sledgehammers. And many of those sledgehammers are actually going to become less effective over time. Analytics is in some ways, it's getting better and better. But analytics is guessing. And when you're guessing, you frequently have to scrape up a bunch of good guys with the bad guys in order to be sure. Right. And so, our dependence on analytics at the core of what we do is actually, it's not the right long-term decision for us to make. And there's going to need to be some adaptation there in terms of the tools that we use. The second piece around that is, we're actually choosing to use tools that are going to go dark over time. As we talked about earlier, right, with people moving to layer 2 solutions like Lightning, the traditional way we've used analytics as the tool to try and carve out bad actors is going to become less and less effective over time, rather than more and more effective. And so, rather than looking at tools that do enforcement through spying on everybody on the blockchain, which, frankly, I don't think is the, solution any of us wanted. I don't think for me, I want all the transactions that I want to be able to be viewed by my government, be viewed by Facebook, and be viewed by my next door neighbor's smart kid. That's not why I got into crypto. So I think that what has to happen is we need to move, off of the blockchain tier into the application tier, and for compliance to happen on a peer-to-peer basis between the counterparties, rather than based on, what's going to be happening on an increasingly obscured blockchain.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been really good catching up with you. Do you want to give us an idea of where we can learn a little bit more about you, find you? People maybe will follow you on Medium, follow you on Twitter. Where would you like to direct people? Yeah,
totally. On Twitter, I'm at Justin W. Newton. That's a great place to find me. And you can learn more about the company and what we're working on there at netkey.com, netki.com. And any of you that are going to be down at the BTC 2022 conference next week, please stop by the panel on Thursday, talking about a pretty exciting project that we worked on.
Well, that's great, Justin. And it's been great learning from your experience here. We'll hope to have you back on again. It's good to talk to. We don't often talk, or I don't often talk, I should say. I've interviewed all sorts of project leaders. KYC AML is something that is easy to take for granted, I suppose. While at the same time, it's completely necessary.
Yeah, it's definitely, from our perspective, one of the key enabling technologies for crypto is really getting this piece right. And, frankly, we're happy to get to play that part in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I always thought trustless was a horrible piece of advice and a horrible marketing tool. I don't know what is trustless about the NFT space or the crypto space. It requires a ton of trust from people who, are mistrust the government on general principle, but are ready to hand over, $20,000 over to Starfire 169XXX or something like that. Of course, now I sound like old man shake stick at cloud. I mean, but you know what I mean. Like it's all kind of wacky to me.
Hey, different people put their trust in different places.
True. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate having you here. Thank you, Justin.
Amazing.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. All right. Well, thank you. Everyone, like and subscribe. Leave comments because we always get these like leave some comments. Tell me, ask me why this stupid thing on the side of this side of my head is sticking up like that because I didn't get ready in time. Whatever, we need to get some interactions going. Logan, you're fantastic as always. Thank you so much for coming out and co-hosting with me today. It's actually a surprisingly interesting subject in a lot of ways. I mean, it's easy to take KYC, AML for granted, but if we can't trust our own customers, if we can't trust the investors and the investors can't trust the projects, then the whole thing kind of grinds to a halt. Like we really haven't gotten away from the need for human-to-human trust.
No, we really haven't. The only thing that is trustless is smart contract execution if it's in the code, right? And that being said, on which blockchain, right? Because probably only Ethereum. The rest of them are centralized and have gone down. So you can't trust on execution during those times.
So Logan said just only Ethereum. So everybody bear that in mind. He says Logan's an Ethereum maximalist.
No, Bitcoin and Ethereum, of course. The difference being that those are actually truly decentralized blockchains, or at least we hope so.
All right. Well, anyway, thanks so much for coming out, Logan. I guess we will please everyone like and subscribe and look for us at 5 p.m. ET on Mondays and Fridays. And next week, we have Julie Pacino coming on Friday to talk about her NFT drop. And the first feature film that's ever been funded, she's doing a horror film that's funded through NFTs. So it's actually a pretty cool business case.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.